There's a big reason why so many politicians suck today that you've probably never even considered. I'm Ryan, and do you ever wonder why there's so few actual leaders in government? Why it feels like they're all constantly playing it safe or seem allergic to behaving like genuine people? You might know all the typical answers: corruption, gerrymandering, that sort of thing. And don't get me wrong, all that stuff's really important. But it's not what I'm talking about today. As ridiculous as it might sound, a big reason why so many politicians suck today is because almost all of them have a terrible obsession, an obsession with opinion polls. Let me explain. Everybody knows what opinion polls are, right? They're those surveys that a pollster, the organization or person conducting the poll, uses to figure out what people think about an issue or a person or a policy. Politicians love polls because they're a really powerful tool to understand what the public thinks about something. And obviously, if you want to get reelected, you shouldn't make the people who vote for you too upset. Here's an example. Minority Leader Chuck Schumer has been criticized lately for being out of step with a Democratic Party base that's itching for a more decisive and confrontational response to the Trump administration. Part of the reason why he's afraid of being more confrontational is that he is obsessed with not doing anything too aggressive until the polls say it's okay. In a recent New York Times interview, Senator Schumer was asked about the Democratic Party's strategy for combating the Trump administration, and here's what he said.
I want to talk a little bit about the Democrats' strategy more broadly. Last month, you said in an interview that Trump will screw up.
Yes. He can't help himself.
Do you really think, though, that there's something that will move the needle for either Republican legislators or voters?
I ask because that feels like a familiar argument against the president. Surely this will be the final straw.
There's no final straw. It's all the things he's doing. But let me say this. Last time he was president, which is the closest experience we have with him, admittedly, the world has changed some, particularly on the media side, how it works. We kept pushing and pushing and pushing and chipping away. And when he went below 40% in the polls, the Republican legislators started working with us. He was at 51. He's now at 48. We're going to keep at it until he goes below 40.
Did you notice that nowhere in that answer did Democrats have an active role? He was asked, what is the Democratic strategy? And his response was, wait until Trump screws up enough that his approval falls in the polls enough that Republicans feel safe enough to work with Democrats again. This is what poll fixation looks like. And it's a problem in all of U.S. politics, but in my opinion, it's a total rot to the Democratic Party in particular. Now, don't get me wrong, polls can be a very helpful tool, invaluable even, especially in the midst of an election season. But we're not in an election season, and poll obsession right now just makes Democrats seem like we don't actually believe anything. It makes Democrats seem like the kinds of politicians that everybody hates. This obsession is making politicians miss so much of what drives support for a candidate or for a party. It makes politicians bad leaders, and it makes our form of government actually function worse. To understand why politicians are so obsessed with polls, first you have to recognize that because politicians are not average voters, politicians are always trying to understand what the average voter thinks. Some politicians develop very interesting methods to try and divine the will of the voters. Chuck Schumer, for example, before he makes any decisions, is known to actually have two imaginary friends called the O'Reillys that he filters his opinions about middle-class issues through. Politicians are obsessed with understanding the median voter to the point of doing fan fiction about the imaginary voters that they make up in their heads. The O'Reillys are Chuck Schumer's approximation of what an average family in New York is like, and he uses this filter of what he imagines the average family to be like to analyze politics. Not all politicians are so eccentric, though, which brings us to the much more normal tool that politicians use to analyze voter preferences, the opinion poll. Immigration was a losing issue for Democrats in 2024. This is pretty clear when we look at the data. So when Kilmar Abrego Garcia was unlawfully sent to Sicotte in El Salvador, see my video here if you're interested in hearing my thoughts on that, politicians like Gavin Newsom were skittish about the Democratic Party taking a strong public stance on what Governor Newsom clearly thought was a losing issue for the Democratic Party.
Yeah, it's this is the distraction of the day. The art of distraction. Don't get distracted by distractions, we say, and here we zig and zag. This is the debate they want. This is their 80-20 issue as they've described it. You know, those that believe in the rule of law defending it, but it's a tough case because people are they defending MS-13? Are they defending, someone who's out of sight, out of mind in El Salvador? I mean, we're perfect sheep.
Journalists Nate Silver and Matthew Iglesias also raised the alarm about Democrats making too much of an issue out of the Abrego Garcia case, since immigration, according to the polling, was a winning issue for Republicans, and they thought that Democrats should be emphasizing other issues where they were stronger. Matthew Iglesias specifically is important here because he's a big booster of a theory called popularism. Popularism, which is different from populism, is all about politicians emphasizing popular positions and de-emphasizing or moderating on unpopular positions. Okay, now let's take a look at what happened to American public opinion on immigration since the Abrego Garcia story broke. On April 15th, Kilmar Abrego Garcia was illegally sent to Sicotte in El Salvador, and Trump was +5 on immigration. On April 17th, Senator Van Hollen went to El Salvador and demanded a meeting with Mr. Abrego Garcia, and Trump was still about +5 on immigration. At this point, if you just looked at the polling, approval of Trump's immigration policy seemed to be the only thing holding steady, while his approval in all other areas was declining. This steadiness is probably what convinced more skittish Democrats to try and downplay this issue. Almost immediately after this, though, American approval of Trump's immigration policy dropped into the negatives after a week-long media cycle dominated by the Abrego Garcia case. Of course, nobody knows what will happen in the future, but it looks like, at least in the short term, the Newsom theory of how to respond to the Abrego Garcia case was incorrect, not only from a moral point of view, in my opinion, but also from a strategic point of view. The popularist theory of politics is important to keep in mind, I think, especially as an election strategy again, but the failure of Democrats like Newsom to see beyond the current polling landscape, to see beyond what's currently popular or unpopular according to polls, is why he missed an opportunity to shift the narrative on immigration, and Senator Van Hollen didn't. And this is really a central point. What people who focus so much on polling sometimes miss is that public opinion isn't just some unchangeable fact of life that politicians can only react to. They're focused so much on trying to ride the wave of public opinion that they miss the fact that politicians, pundits, media personalities, all of these people have an outsized role in shaping public opinion in response to events. To give some historical examples and context for what I mean here, I'd like to introduce my friend and fellow YouTuber André Dutra. He makes fantastic videos about history and culture that I would absolutely recommend that you go check out.
Thanks, Ryan. The idea of the president steering public opinion goes back to Theodore Roosevelt and the bully pulpit, a term he coined to signify the use of the platform of the presidency to persuade the public. Before the progressive era, the president was more of a far-off figure that the average American didn't have to give much thought to, but new technological developments were making us a more interconnected nation. The expansion of media consumption among Americans allowed the chief executive to make a direct appeal to voters, and consequently, national leaders were less beholden to a local party boss. Roosevelt used newspapers to bypass urban political machines, advocating for policies that went against their interests, such as consumer protection and regulation of monopolies. The federal government played an increasingly prominent part in the lives of its citizens, ushering in not only the start of the modern regulatory state as we know it, but also the modern presidency. One whose effects could be felt by the average person, and one whose advocacy became a core tenet of the office. Franklin Roosevelt used his fireside chats to advocate for the New Deal. JFK gave a speech on why we choose to go to the moon, and Ronald Reagan was known as the great communicator for a reason.
Thanks so much, Andre. This video is actually part of a collaboration with Andre, and I'll be appearing in his video about Andrew Jackson talking about populism on his channel. These videos should be releasing at the same time, so definitely go check that out as soon as you're done with this video. But to bring it back, the hyperfixation that some politicians have on conforming their message to current polling trends, even when they're not under the constraints that come with something like an election campaign, is just missing the fact that people don't come to their opinions by accident. There's a whole information ecosystem out there that helps people come to their opinions. But if you want to shape public opinion, you have to actually engage with it, not just follow it. Before Donald Trump, the Republican Party was generally much more supportive of free trade. Today, the Republican Party is a hyper-protectionist party, and Trump imposes new tariffs seemingly at random via tweet. How is it possible that Trump was able to make a policy that, in my opinion, isn't just bad, but also was ostensibly unpopular with Republicans before 2016, a core pillar of the Republican Party's identity? I think the key here is that Trump wasn't just proposing tariffs as an isolated policy proposal. Tariffs were part of the broader narrative that Trump was selling about protecting Americans from foreign competition and influence. Trump can be incredibly incoherent when he talks about actual policy positions. He talks about trade deficits as if they're budget deficits. He sometimes seems to think that claiming asylum in the United States means that you're literally from a mental asylum. But from a narrative point of view, Trump is actually fairly consistent. Almost all of Trump's policy positions are framed as a way to protect Americans and generally to protect Americans from foreigners. Because he was able to make this narrative resonate with so many people, he was able to drag the party whichever way he wanted in terms of actual policy, as long as his policy proposals could fit within the broader narrative. Tariffs aren't a tax on consumers. They're a way to stop foreign countries from taking advantage of America. This is how Trump was able to totally flip the standard Republican consensus on something like trade policy. That's the power of narrative, and it's something that you will absolutely miss if you're trying too hard to be perfectly poll tested. One mistake that I think people who closely follow politics often make is assuming that the average undecided voter is an ideological moderate. Someone who's maybe a little anti-immigration, but that's balanced out by being a little pro-choice, someone like that. Basically, I think when a lot of people imagine an undecided voter, they imagine someone who has, through careful engagement with politics, come to support a position that just so happens to be in the middle on a lot of issues. People like this do exist, no doubt, but I don't think that describes the average undecided voter. People who are undecided voters are often not very interested in politics at all, or are very cynical about it. They often have views that may seem wildly incoherent to someone who's well-informed about politics or is very ideological about politics. In my opinion, winning these people isn't just a matter of being perfectly poll tested. The undecided voter isn't undecided because they're very informed and also very moderate on every issue. That kind of person is generally just as much of an illusion as Chuck Schumer's imaginary middle-class friends. And because of that, it's not guaranteed that just a slightly more moderate message will appeal to undecided voters. To appeal to undecided voters, you need a strong narrative. You can't just be right by the numbers. Most people aren't going to take the time to read the numbers. Your message has to resonate with them in their soul. Narrative also isn't something that's built just by one candidate in one election cycle. Harris's campaign in 2024 was clearly able to be painted as much more progressive than it actually was based on positions that she took when she was trying to win the 2020 Democratic primary. And while I think we should be somewhat skeptical of polls that ask people which candidate they thought was more extreme, since extreme is kind of a pejorative and people often just use too extreme, I think, as an after-the-fact justification for liking the other guy more, it's still important to remember that the narrative of the Harris campaign began way before the 2024 Harris campaign actually began. It was shaped by Harris herself, but also by the general public's perception of the Democratic Party writ large. I think it's kind of easy to deride undecided voters as just being uninformed or voting on vibes and whatever else. And while I, of course, want voters to be as informed as possible, obviously, I think by extending a little charity, we can better understand why this happens. If someone is uninformed or has conflicting views on policy issues or feels equally divided between the Republican and Democratic parties, regardless of what we, the politics addicted, might think about this, how would someone in this position, and there are a lot of people in this position, regardless of what we think about it, decide who to vote for except on vibes, on how much the narrative presented by each candidate and by each party resonates with them? We can choose to be upset about this. We can choose to shake our fist at the clouds and say, read more Substack bloggers or whatever. Or we can accept the fact that strength of narrative is actually just a very important part of how a lot of people decide who to vote for. And that in order to win elections, it is necessary to accommodate that preference. Bearing that in mind, one factor that's crucial to building a persuasive and coherent political narrative is authenticity. Nothing does more to destroy someone's authenticity than being so blatantly driven by current polling data. Why would someone support you if they think you're just an empty suit who will switch positions whenever it's convenient? When Governor Newsom calls something a distraction because it touches on an issue that polls say is unpopular for Democrats, that comes across as skeevy and dishonest. I know Gavin is partway through his rebrand as a moderate ahead of the inevitable 2028 presidential run, but let's be serious for a second. Voters may not be informed on the policy specifics, but nobody likes that. Bernie Sanders is more left-wing than Kamala Harris. Because of that, someone who's just focused on issue polling might expect someone like Bernie to be less popular uniformly with all types of moderate conservatives than Kamala Harris, since ostensibly, Kamala Harris is closer to all types of moderate conservatives than Bernie, ideologically. Joe Rogan, who I think is the sort of prototype for a vaguely conservative-coded type of guy, of course, just endorsed Trump in the last election, but he's also been very positive about Bernie Sanders. How does that make sense? Some of this might just be an attempt to cling on to some moderate cred. Some of this might be because they have different perceptions of Bernie and Harris as people. But I'm really interested in one particular reason for liking Bernie that you hear a lot from this type of guy.
He's been insanely consistent his entire life. He's basically been saying the same thing, been for the same thing his whole life. And that, in and of itself, is a very powerful structure.
They might like some of his policies, but clearly a big part of what makes an actual democratic socialist like Sanders acceptable in their eyes isn't just the socialist part. It's because they perceive him as being a real person with a consistent belief system. This is only possible because Bernie has, in fact, had a very consistent narrative throughout his very long political career. He's perceived as being authentic. There's a very strong perception that he's going to win or lose on his true beliefs, which is not only an attractive quality in a political candidate, it's also an ideal that's critical to the functioning of a representative democracy. What do I mean by that? Well, why do we have elected representatives anyway? You know, there's a lot of other ways we could organize our government if we wanted to. We could have some kind of direct democracy where every person votes on every issue directly. We could have some kind of sortition system where people are randomly selected to be lawmakers, kind of like how we do juries. Some of J.D. Vance's buddies think that we should have a king. So why do we have this system where we choose specific people to run the government and to make laws on our behalf? Implicit, I think, in the idea of having elected representatives at all instead of a direct democracy or some sort of sortition type system is the idea that some people are better for the job of being a legislator than others. Just as we don't think that everyone is equally good at playing baseball, we don't think that everyone is equally good at the job of governing. Now, we don't always do the best job at this, but in a democratic republic, the idea is that we want to identify and vote for the people that we think would do the best job at governing. But what does it mean to be a good representative? This is where things start to get kind of tricky and where an obsession with polling, I think, can start throwing some wrenches into our system. It's a common view that a good politician is someone who, in all cases, does what the majority of their constituents want. I want to challenge this view a little, both from a theoretical and from a practical perspective. Theoretically, if all a politician is supposed to do is just be a reflection of the average opinion of the people that they represent, aren't we really just running a very inefficient version of a direct democracy? I mean, truly, if we don't expect a representative to ever inject their own personal thoughts, background, or expertise into the lawmaking process, then we might as well not have representatives at all. If this is the opinion that you hold, then all a representative represents for you is the opportunity for one person's opinions to override the will of the people that they represent. I do think it's important for politicians to honor their promises and the trust placed in them by the people that sent them to their position. But when a politician goes to Congress, for example, they aren't just making laws for their district. They're making laws for the whole country. They exercise a certain amount of power over the whole country. And so they are, in my opinion, obligated not just to act in the manner that they think the majority of their constituents would prefer, but also consider what's right and what would be in the best interests of the entire nation. Ultimately, though, the politician is accountable to the people that elect them, and the constituents reserve their right to throw the politician out of office at regular intervals if they feel that the person representing them is doing a bad job. I also think policy positions aren't the only thing we should consider when choosing a leader. Someone might agree with you on most issues and still be totally unworthy of a position of public trust. They might not have the kind of temperament you need to lead during a crisis. They they might have conflicts of interest or a history of corruption. They might just be a bad person. These are all qualities that, in addition to policy positions, I think people should consider when choosing their leaders. But that's enough philosophizing. I think that in practice, following the will of your constituents very often just means very crude rule by polling data, since polling is one of the most powerful tools we have for understanding what voters think that they want. As I said at the start of the video, polls can be very powerful tools to help politicians understand what their voters want. But as I've hopefully made clear throughout the rest of the video, relying too much on polling data can make politicians miss opportunities to shift public opinion through narrative. It can also make them worse leaders, and it makes them seem inauthentic. Politicians who do not have an authentic connection to the voters, who do not intuitively understand what people want from them, can prop themselves up for a long time by relying on polling data. I don't think that this is great, but there have always been cynical and bad politicians. What I'm more concerned about is that I'm certain that there are some otherwise good politicians out there who have ideals, who could do a very good job at actually shaping public opinion instead of just responding to it, that have been made worse by polling obsession, by over-relying on a tool that they don't really understand and utilizing it at times when it's totally inappropriate or even actively counterproductive. I would never tell a professional politician to just throw out polling, but an obsession with polling, an obsession with being the perfect poll-tested politician is also undeniably part of what makes so many politicians just suck. Thanks for making it all the way to the end. I'm Ryan. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please like, comment, subscribe so you see future videos, share with a friend. It really helps the video get to more people. Thanks so much again. See you next time.